lots of practice owners I talk to don't have agreements at all. And then they get really bummed when someone sets up next door and advertises to all of their patients. So having an agreement in place can help work through the sorts of issues that might occur in your practice if you haven't thought about them. And thirdly, proper employment agreements. So I've seen some employment agreements over the last year or so when the Fair Work requirements have become a lot tighter. So sometimes what you need from legal is it depends on what's happening, and it's not the lawyer's fault. It's actually what's happening in Canberra or happening in the courts that makes medical professionals need to focus on certain areas.
All right, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast, and I'm really excited today. I've got Sarah Bartholomeusz. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, great pronunciation of my name.
Thank you. As a GP who did most of their work in the western suburbs of Melbourne, I remember we had something like 180 different nationalities. I had to be good at this.
It served you well.
Thank you. Now, what we want to get to today, Sarah is the founder of uLegal and a lawyer, and we really want to answer the question that's in a lot of people's minds around legal advice. You know, what's the right amount? What's too much? You know, could I be paying for things that maybe I don't need, or they're adding unnecessary complexity? We really want to focus on the Goldilocks zone today. So what I'd love to do, Sarah, is throw to you to talk a little bit about uLegal, how you started that, what drove you to start it, and who you serve in that business.
Sure. So I started my practice almost 12 years ago, actually. Next week it's 12 years. And I started it when I was made redundant from my corporate role. So I was 7 months pregnant at the time. And I started it with 0 clients, thinking actually it'll be less risk for me to start my own business than to get another job where I essentially as a lawyer have 1 client. And I don't know if that was sort of the hormones or something that made me a little bit delusional, because starting your own business is actually a lot of work. But I kind of eased into it with having the baby and then coming back to it. And it was not immediately, but shortly after I started the business that I met a doctor who said, actually, there's not that many doctor-focused or practice-focused law firms. And so that could be an opportunity for you. And they knew that I came from a family of doctors. So surgeons, dentists, actually health professionals, I should say, GP. My cousins are specialising in paediatrics now. So got a physio, a nurse, all of these different health professionals. And I thought, actually, that's a cohort that I really care about and that I want to protect. And so having a protection focus in my practice rather than a litigation focus has been really important to us. And we believe at uLegal that when we're helping health professionals and medical professionals, that we're helping all Australians, because in focusing on corporate governance, we're helping your business as a health professional, but then we're helping you focus more on your patients, and your business is protected, which means that's better for everybody who needs to access health and medical in Australia.
Absolutely. I think, anybody who works to serve that sector is a part of the solutions that are provided. What about if we go to kind of the sort of things where you think, you know what, these are areas where if I had a magical checklist that I could put in front of every owner, and, 8, 9 out of 10 owners are doctors in general practices. If I could put a list in front of people as to the things I would like them to attend to based on some of the stuff that, you've come across, you think, oh, geez, if I had some time with you 3 months, 6 months, 2 years ago, we could have done something about this. What's on that list of things that you think, you know what, I'd really like these people to avoid this quicksand?
Yeah, so actually, I had coffee with someone on Friday who had that question, and she had a fairly small practice, no partners. So I'll explain that bit after. But what I said to her is she really needs to have a privacy policy. She didn't have one. And there's some big risks with not having one and big fines that you can have, and all health professionals need one. So if you deal with sensitive information under the Privacy Act, which is what all medical and health professionals deal with, they need a privacy policy. And she didn't know that. And I don't think she's alone. The second one was she was looking at bringing on an independent practitioner. And so having a proper agreement in that respect is absolutely critical. Lots of practice owners I talk to don't have agreements at all. And then they get really bummed when someone sets up next door and advertises to all of their patients. So having an agreement in place can help work through the sorts of issues that might occur in your practice if you haven't thought about them. And thirdly, proper employment agreements. So I've seen some employment agreements over the last year or so when the Fair Work requirements have become a lot tighter. So sometimes what you need from legal is it depends on what's happening, and it's not the lawyer's fault. It's actually what's happening in Canberra or happening in the courts that makes medical professionals need to focus on certain areas. And so, yeah, employment agreements. I saw a practice recently came to us and they were using one agreement for nurses and admin staff. And they're two completely different awards. One's a professional role and one is a more administrative role. So they're two different awards under Fair Work, and really you need to treat those different employees separately.
Absolutely. And they have 1 week difference in annual leave at least. So you want to make sure you get that right.
Yeah. There's a few differences. And they said, oh, okay, well, we'll put this on the back burner. We've got other things going on. And I was like, okay, but, I really think it's something to prioritize. The other one, which wasn't so necessary for the person I had coffee with on Friday, but having a proper owner's agreement or shareholders agreement, whatever your legal structure is, will dictate what that's called. And that might be a unit trust, in which case it might be an equity holders agreement or a unit holders agreement. And that's not the deed that you get when you incorporate those entities. It's a separate agreement. So that is important for how you're going to run the business together, and also how succession is going to work in your practice, because we know that people don't live forever, or people don't want to work until they die. And if they do work until they die, they want to know how their assets going to be transferred as well. So along with that, we often suggest a buy-sell agreement, which is what happens if something happens to you. So that's not necessarily dealt with in a shareholders agreement. It's a separate agreement, and you can have insurance that helps the owners, particularly if they're new to practice or younger. That can be having a life insurance policy on the practice can be really worthwhile.
All right, I'm going to read them back to you, and we'll just make sure we haven't left any gaps. So in terms of the things that need to be covered, privacy policy, number one, everybody needs that because they're dealing with sensitive information. Service and facility agreements are the way that we engage our practitioners in particular. And I think you and I share this common frustration of people saying, hey, who's got one of these they can share with me? Could I just take a copy of this? That's a really bad idea, and I'm going to get you to tap into that in a moment. So privacy policy, service and facility agreements, employment agreements, shareholder agreement, and plus minus a buy-sell agreement on the back end of that. Was there anything else in the basic documentation that people need to be thinking about as a checklist in their mind as they're listening?
So it really does depend on at what stage of your business you're up to. So if you're entering into a lease, or you've bought a property and you need a lease between your entities, that's a really important document as well. And if you're going to engage with pathology, we see doctors, and I can think of a lot of bad news stories where doctors just haven't really understood that it's a highly regulated area, and they get letters from the government or the regulator saying, how come you have this agreement? And they're like, well, what do you mean? How come I have this agreement? Because we want to have pathology because it helps our patients. But unfortunately, the government puts it all back on the doctors and the pathology companies often just kind of do what they want, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It seems very unjust, and one of the you legal's values is justice. So I feel very aggrieved when people get those letters, because I just don't understand how the law kind of is penalising our clients.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're right. People make an assumption that the pathology companies would be across all of the rules and regulations and wouldn't recommend or sign agreements that don't comply with the Red Book requirements. And yet it commonly happens. And in fact, most of what I've observed is all of the proposals to kind of break or breach those guidelines are done by the other side. And so that's easily something I could get on a rant about, but I won't do that. What I'm going to do instead is circle back to hey, could you just flip me a copy of your doctor agreements? And I'm just going to use that. Walk me through why that's not a great idea.
Well, what we found in practicing in this area for a number of years now is that every practice operates slightly differently. And if you're asking for an agreement from someone on the internet, even ChatGPT, we've seen agreements that have been prepared by AI that are going to get you in trouble, essentially. So the law requires that the agreement reflect what you do in practice, and the agreement needs to reflect your practice and how you work. And you want to get advice so that you don't get caught up as a sham contractor, which is where you say someone's a contractor, but they're actually an employee at law. And that's complex, and that's under federal law. Then we've got payroll tax, which is a state or territory law, different in every state and territory. And so if you had an agreement that maybe was from another practice that was compliant in one state or territory, you don't know that it's going to work for you, particularly if you're a practice that operates across different jurisdictions, which many do. And so payroll tax is a big area now, and it's one of those things I mentioned earlier that we get annoyed that it's the courts and the legislature really that change things and make things harder or change things so that doctors do need to get legal advice. And that's one of the areas that's been really big over the past couple of years that people have been wading through, and it's been changing a lot, which is also frustrating for people.
Yes, huge differences between states in their stated approach to this and the compliance requirements. And so it does vary. I think people that are listening, the owners listening or prospective owners, need to appreciate that the end document that comes from the engagement of your legal advisor, that's the tool you use to engage your GPs. Usually I'd call that a service and facility agreement. You may have different terminology. But in terms of the end result, it's actually the product of a lot of conversations. And you just talked about, the owners probably need to make some trade-offs in terms of understanding, well, if I go this way, I expose myself to a different group of risks than if I kind of choose an alternative pathway. And it's super important to understand what are the risks that I'm choosing. You can't operate a business with zero risk. That business doesn't exist. In fact, those people are the ones who never set businesses up. And so you do have to understand the risks, and ideally, in most cases, you can either measure that risk and understand the quantum of it, or understand that you can lay it off through some kind of insurances, etc. And so it might be worthwhile, Sarah, just to give a brief overview of areas where people kind of make common mistakes or assumptions in the way they engage GPs that are kind of orange flags or red flags for you and potentially more broadly.
And I guess that's another reason to not use a template agreement, isn't it? Because every business owner chooses the risks that they're comfortable with. And so if you're just using a template from someone, you don't know the thought and effort and advice that's gone into that as well, which puts you at risks you don't even know that you're taking, which is scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to circle back to one of the things you talked about earlier, which I think is a big problem. Sometimes compliance work can fall into the kind of grudge purchase bucket. People are like, I have to do it. I don't really want to do it. It'd be like accreditation. There's a bunch of things probably in that bucket. And people put things on the back burner, so it's kind of like it's not something I want to give attention to now because I feel in blank. I've got this stuff on my plate. Walk me through some examples of where I'll just defer this for a month or two has become years, and that's become a problem for people.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was going to do the orange flag thing first. Do you want me to do
Okay,
that?
yeah, do
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
so
yeah.
we've recently been working with a GP who is very experienced and very open to taking risks that they think they can manage. And so we've done that red flag, orange flag thing with the agreement that we've prepared for them. And one of the things that they had is, they want the GPs to work a certain number of days, which is a red flag, and they want them to be committed for a certain number of years. Also, a red flag. And so, but that's their prerogative. So, yeah, that I guess the other red flags have to do with control. And so those control factors, asking people to wear a uniform is a control factor, requiring them to come to meetings is a control factor. So those sorts of things where actually some practices we've seen that want that control and want to create a certain culture in their business are moving more towards having employees.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying is they want all of the benefits of employment, like engagement, but they're not classifying the agreement in that vein, and therefore, if others classify it that way, then that presents a problem for them payroll tax wise, and potentially all of the other things that go on. It might be worth just talking a little bit about payroll tax as one thing. People may not think about the other areas where they could be punished. Do you want to spend a little bit of time just talking about that?
Yeah, so the other area really in relation to independent practitioners is where they're actually not independent enough to be deemed contractors, that they are deemed to be employees. And so there's risks with sham contracting where there's financial penalties that the government can require you to pay, but also you might be required to pay annual leave for the term of that person's working with you, or other forms of leave. Superannuation is another one that's been really affecting clients of ours. So when you're saying a story in relation to where we've seen things go wrong, we did have a practice owner come to us. She'd been a practice owner for years and years and years. So she'd been working, maybe she'd had her practice for 40 years, and she had people working with her. Basically, they graduated together and they'd always worked together independently. And one of them must have been doing research on the internet, or someone's accountant mentioned to them that maybe they weren't independent. And she never had agreements with them. There was nothing in writing, but they'd been working together for so long that this risk of paying super for all that time, or the time that it was relevant, leave entitlements, long service leave came in for her because they'd been working together for so long. So actually kind of looking at that issue and working out what to do and how to protect her moving forward, because we can't often do anything about what's happened in the past, but we can certainly set you up for the future. And that was what this person I had coffee with on Friday said. She was like, well, it's like a family, my business. We all kind of get along, and I don't want to present them with new employment agreements just because the one that I got from my husband from the practice that he ran a few years ago isn't up to date anymore. And I said, well, that's okay. Like, maybe what we can do is set you up for the future, and your next hire can have the new agreement, and you can just understand the risks for the ones that you've got at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's pretty scary when you think about the quantum of accrued risks
I
that.
know, I know. I can see your mind being blown on that.
Well, one of my hats was being at a publicly listed corporate, and so we went and did due diligence on a lot of practices. What you're saying was not uncommon, where people had worked together for 30 years, zero agreements in place, documenting the nature of the engagement. Sort of, it's like everything. I think it kind of works until it doesn't. And then the problem is that the accumulated risks are so high that when it no longer works and somebody doubts it, the whole 30 years, 40 years worth of what you've constructed and built can be really pulled away pretty quickly. So,
and on that, what we see is, people do have good relationships, but what happens sometimes is people's mental health changes. And that's where we see big changes. If people, we saw it a lot during the pandemic where people were afraid at work, doctors, and that they just weren't themselves, or they have something happen where they're not taking notes properly, or and as a practice owner, you don't have the agreement in place, you kind of are left out, taking a lot of risk that you actually don't get remunerated for as a practice owner that well. To be taking huge risks, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often people don't want to invest the time and the money, and that's probably useful for us to cover off on that, because it's an insurance policy working with good legal advisors, and you don't get a lot of credit for the problems you prevent.
It's interesting you say that. When we do hear about it, we kind of are so happy. So we recently reviewed a lease for a aspiring practice owner, and we reviewed it, and there were quite a few red flags. And so she decided not to go ahead, and she ran into someone else who rented in that building, and that person said, "You dodged a bullet, not renting from that person." And she called me and told me, and I was so happy, because you always get props for fighting a fire that you can see as a lawyer. But if you stop the fire before it gets to your house, you get nothing unless someone tells you like that. So yes, there are risks. We help you mitigate them, and you may not be glorious at the moment, but it's absolutely worth the investment, as you say, insurance.
Yeah, and I think that the two things that are probably important that I'd like listeners and anyone watching to take home, there's a world of difference between a generalist and a specialist in this space. For example, you do need to be familiar with the Red Book guidelines. You do need to be familiar with state-by-state payroll tax implications, what kind of mechanisms you use to reduce or mitigate or neutralise that risk. This is not a space to have your mate down the road doing the work. And I see this in accounting, and I see this in law regularly. And I've almost never, this might be confirmation bias, but I've almost never seen it where it ends well. I think about so many conversations I've had where I was like, why are you using that person for that? That's just not the right advisor for that. So specialists are one thing. The second thing is to not fall into the trap of doing this sometime later, because when the tide goes out, if you're standing there without your clothes on, then you've only got yourself to blame. This is really important. And maybe what we could talk about for a moment, Sarah, is if people are frustrated by the kind of time commitment, look, people are often frustrated by spending money. I think, money for expertise is a part of business. If you can't do that, you shouldn't be in business. How do we abbreviate the amount of time that we spend on this? Because I'll speak from my perspective, but I've played the circular email thing with lawyers many times, and the nightmare Word document with, 5,000 markups and all that kind of stuff. And my personal approach has often been to say, let's get everybody in a room and just walk through it so that we understand what all the trade-offs. We'll make our commitments and then circulate the document at the end. How can we make something that's kind of long and painful into shorter and less painful?
Yeah, it's great question, especially when we're dealing with people who are busy, and we know that. And so what we do is we simplify it as much as possible. We've sort of got very clear steps that we work through. So let's talk about a practitioner services agreement. We get your instructions. We often do that through a Word document, and we mostly have practice managers do that for us. So if you're starting up, maybe it's you and you want to make those decisions, so that's fine. Then based on that, we do the first draft and we send it. You book a call with you and your practice manager, or just your practice manager, depending on how sophisticated they are, and then we make changes to that. And so we find that scope for agreements, and we do that with all our agreements, 99.999% of the time that works, and that's a fixed fee, and it's extremely simple and straightforward. Sometimes people want to give instructions to us over the phone rather than fill out the form, and that's fine too. It just might take, or you might just have then a time in your diary that you have to do it rather than having the flexibility. The times we find that that maybe it needs to have a bit more time is where there's multiple owners and everyone wants to have a say or has a different perspective. And so that's when we would say that call, let's do it with everyone in the room. And that can help, but sometimes people still want to have a little bit more say, and that's totally fine. It just might cost a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is you just do need to make progress on these, and over time they may well evolve the agreements when you find that there are areas that you thought you covered, but maybe somebody discovered a weakness in what you've done. That's a really important way of doing this. I think just the abbreviated nature of this, because I want people listening to not ever put this stuff on the back burner. These are things that can kill your practice, and if it kills your practice, then it kills your future livelihood, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to build something that is fragile in that way.
And we always say the earlier the better. So we recently have been having all these people who are starting up their practices or buying into a practice and just get wanting to get absolutely everything watertight for the moment from where things are right now in the law. And it makes me so happy. That's like my whole message. Protect your practice and do it from the beginning.
Yep. Nice. And so that's a nice segue into the next question I had, which is, so you do go and get everything sorted out and you address the areas that you and I have just explored. How often should you review it? What about going back to it? Like you said, you don't want these kind of, they're not like fine wines, are they? Little agreements. They don't get better with age.
They don't. And actually, we had someone come back to us with an agreement. They had a new practitioner starting who had some questions about the agreement, and they had the agreement done 3 years ago. And Todd, a lot has happened in 3 years in the area of practitioner services agreement. And they said, oh, can you just review this based on the questions they've asked? And I said, gave them two options. Yes, we can do that. Or we can totally update your agreement. And it's for a lesser fee, obviously, than our usual one, because updating it isn't a brand new one, because there's been a lot of changes in the last 3 years. So I would say annually is a good idea to look at areas of the law that are changing. And you know that because you're probably in Facebook groups or you get newsletters from the AMA or RACGP that tell you that there's changes in the law. I sign up to all the Fair Work ones because there's lots of changes in Fair Work. And those newsletters, if you're a director of a business, you have an obligation to keep up to date with the changes. So that's a good way to do it, I think, and no cost to you. And then you can ask. So, our clients ask us, do we need to update things? And because we're professionals, we don't say, no, you need a new one if you don't. That's not how we work. So, that's another option.
Awesome. And I think, again, if you've done the work to do it the first time, it makes sense that you want to make sure that things are continually updated such that they do represent all of the risks in federal and state level. That's super important. The other thing that I had on my mind to ask you about, Sarah, as a business owner yourself and understanding the different growth phases in business, what are the things that people need to think about in the kind of normal growth phases? We talked a little bit about a trend that you've seen towards doctors that are just starting, getting everything comprehensively done at the start. What should people be thinking as they're growing their practice, maybe going to multiple locations through all the different phases? What are the things they need to be thinking about from a legal perspective?
Yeah, we like to think of it as sort of start, grow, exit. So those three stages. And the growth stage is really about kind of having those habits of maybe you have an annual review time, like in your directors meetings or in your practice manager's schedule of things to do, so that you know that things are being reviewed if they need to be reviewed, or at points in time if there's a new employee coming on or new doctor coming on. If you're expanding to a new location, whether you're buying it or getting a lease, getting those agreements checked. And also kind of thinking about what your end game is. Like, are you needing to think about having other associates or other owners come in, and at what point? We've got a client at the moment who's owned their business for years and years and years, probably whole career. The owner doctor's looking at stepping down and they haven't really put that in place yet. And so that's a big job now to find people, whether they work there or whether they need to look for people who are interested in buying in. They want to maintain a certain level of ownership so that there's an income stream for their children. How does that work if the doctor's not practicing? So there's a lot of questions in kind of planning for succession. And I would say do that earlier rather than later. And one of the things in planning for succession is making sure all your agreements are up to date. So we have one practitioner at the moment who's come to us to review an opportunity to buy in, and there's all of these issues with the due diligence. So there's payroll tax risk, there's sham contracting risk, so that then affects the value of the existing owner's investment in their business. And so maybe like getting that advice a few years ago, or even before they started this process, they wouldn't have had the questions. They would have had a much more secure investment to buy into.
Yeah, and that's probably reflective of the type of professional they've engaged. They're engaging somebody that knew the life cycle of a business. They would usually be saying to them, we need to attend to this as well. You might not feel like it's a priority at the moment. You don't necessarily want to sell at the moment, but you do need to build your business as if it's ready for sale. I had a wise mentor that used to say to me, Todd, you're always selling your business. In future, it's either to you or somebody else, but you are selling your business.
And it's true because you actually never know when those opportunities are going to come knocking, if it's a corporate or, somebody or something happens and you need to sell your business because you're not able to work in it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really important to get that work done early. I think in terms of, I've spoken to hundreds of owners of practices, and my perspective, my experience has been that people generally look to sell about 5 years after they should have. And so what happens is the business usually at that point is kind of on a downward trajectory where the peak was maybe 5-6 years prior. Their interest is flagged a bit in it because, they've got other interests in life. That's not necessarily about, they don't care that much about the business, just that they're doing other things. And so they're just not focused on the continual improvement and growth of the business. And I think that the price they get is often half or thereabouts of what they could have received if they sold it at the right time. And a lot of that, I think, is ego and probably a lack of awareness about their own capacity to continue to run the business in the right way. I think that interest can definitely flag. So I think if anybody's listening to this and they're thinking, you know what, I might be exiting in 3, 4, 5 years, this is work you must do now. Now, you might still choose to exit in 3, 4, 5 years, but if you change your mind, or as you said, Sarah, if an opportunity arises earlier, then you've actually got everything ready. So you can say, yeah, I'm prepared to have that conversation, rather than you say, I'm prepared to have a conversation. They submit as if they're ready to go ahead with due diligence and get cracking, and you don't actually have anything done. You've got nothing really of any meaning done. It may take you 6 to 12 months to get that work done. It's quite substantial. So do you have a desired size of practice or age of owner where you would talk about these things with them? Or is this a conversation that sort of everybody should have, do you think?
We usually have that conversation when we're working on shareholders' agreements with people. That's sort of a flag for us, that because you want to potentially make it easy for people to buy in and just to get people thinking about that. So we worked with a practice owner. There were 2 practice owners. One was younger and one was sort of ready to talk about retiring rurally based. We work with a lot of country practitioners who probably have used their local lawyer for most of their careers, and that hasn't, as you mentioned, necessarily set them up as well as it could, because they haven't been people who've worked with a lot of medical practitioners, because they are the country practitioner that does the wills and maybe they're great at reviewing leases and all of the kind of corporate commercial things that don't necessarily need that medical expertise, but that they haven't been flagged on these issues. And so our client, one of the clients who was getting ready to retire, was like, I've been thinking about who in the practice can take over. And yeah, I thought the same thing, like, okay, well, I'm glad you're getting this in place now, and we can set it up for when those newer GPs are ready to buy in. But we don't know at the moment. We haven't even asked them if they want to be business owners, which is a different proposition from being a contractor who kind of turns up and does their hours and leaves.
Yeah. I think there's often the mistake made by people where they think the documentation is the key. And I don't want to mislead people in that it is important that the documentation is there. But that is representing the sum total of all the conversations being documented and kind of laid down. And so you can't shortcut to the documentation without the conversations. it's super important that everybody has a really good understanding of what the expectations are. Because most of this stuff is just really laying down, okay, what are our expectations and how might they fall down? And in what ways would they be met and we would all be satisfied? And a lot of people don't have the stomach for those conversations.
Yeah, and so that's where like a program like yours or having conversations with us can really help guide those conversations, because it does take courage. And what we find with a lot of doctors is they're worried about there being conflict. And the way that you approach those conversations is critical to getting an answer that's open and honest and authentic and can help guide the future of your practice. And you don't have to do that on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two parts to this. One is just because there's some friction, usually that's where the gold is. If you can persist with it, you do need to have these agreements, because if you don't, then the friction just leads to really ugly scenes in terms of just people battling over pieces of the pie effectively. And you can also get facilitation if there's a high degree of misalignment amongst owners. And it may be that the thing prior to the legal agreement is facilitation and to get some kind of an idea about what are the aligned expectations. These are all just human things, right? At the end of the day, humans aren't always agreeable.
It's true. Everybody has different kind of visions and for their life and their purpose and the impact they want to make. And finding the people who are aligned to yours is really critical.
That's the whole jam of life and business. And so the next thing I would love to ask you about is a really common issue in practices that people don't necessarily realize at the time that they join, but a fairly large disparity in ages amongst owners. We'll often have, and again, I find that people don't often talk about these things, but there's quite different objectives, so somebody in the last 5 years of their consulting life might be focused on reducing their hours and kind of contributing less to the practice. And then somebody who's, in their 30s may well be focused on ramping up their work and paying for kids to go to school and houses and whatever else they might be doing. And so very different life phases. Have you got any advice on how people navigate those more tricky combos that are just around the different priorities and focus that people have in life as owners and doctors in the practice?
Yeah, it's something that we work into shareholders agreements firstly, because we have worked with people who are planning on going parental leave or that need to pick up grandchildren or whatever it is, like those different phases of life. And there's some practices that kind of take that in the flow, that if you're sticking around for a long period of time, then there's going to be times when I'm working more and you're working less, and that's fine because it'll come around. But sometimes it's better to have that in writing and an agreement about like what your commitments are. And so we also reflect that in practitioner services agreements for owners, which need to be slightly different. Obviously, you can't have a 30-day termination period for a practice owner. It's going to go back to back with your shareholders agreement or that owner's agreement that you have in place. And so, yeah, I think that it can be tricky. And of course, if you have a non-professional owner, so we often are seeing practice managers coming in as owners because the business value that they can add is massive, but they don't necessarily do billing. And so how do they get taken into account in your shareholders agreement?
One other thing, Sarah, that I've seen a bit is once people kind of get into, and this is, I think there's a certain personality type that enjoys this, but effectively in the owners' agreements, whatever form they take, people are kind of describing specific roles and obligations that come with the ownership, having that badge or that hat, that T-shirt that they're wearing. And sometimes they get right into going very deep into all of these obligations that go with it. And I've had a couple of conversations with people and I'm like, you're actually doing all this stuff now. Like, you people have worked together for 20 years and this doesn't actually sound like a fun place to own a share of. What are you doing? Can we talk a little bit about how people sometimes get right into the kind of, right, you're going to floss your teeth on Monday before you come to work. And if you don't, this is the penalty. Because this is a risk with this stuff, right? You end up in the weeds.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I think it's great to talk about, but what we tend to do is if things are getting very nitty gritty, we suggest maybe having that in a like a policy or like a code of conduct between owners, something that can be more easily changed if circumstances change or if you find that it's just too hard to comply with.
Yep. Yeah. It reminds me of some vibes of the Big Bang Theory, where they would have the roommate agreements and things that they would pull out at times. So yeah, I think you're right. So keep what you're saying is keep the nitty gritty out of the main agreement and have other codes or whatever that you might be
Yeah,
able to
and we
adjust
often
more easily.
say that for employment agreements, people want to put all these promises about CPD they're going to pay for people, and we're just like, you can have that in a policy that you can change. You know, don't commit to that for the duration of this person's employment because you never know when things are going to change.
Yeah, and you can
And they
always
might
do
change for the
more.
better. Yeah.
You can always do more than what the
Yeah.
agreement mandates, and then it's seen as a privilege rather than this is my right. So I think these are really good conversations to have with experienced people because, as you said, no disrespect to the generalists that play a really important role in life more broadly, but in all professions. But I think this is not a space for generalists because it does require expertise and knowledge that's you only ever hopefully have to kind of crack the tin on that, once in your career, maybe twice if you're unlucky. But at that point in time, you want to know that I've paid for the best advice and I have the best chances of getting through this without any problems.
And that's a good point. I had somebody maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago send us their agreement, and we just said, actually, we think you need a new one. This is a practice owner that owned 5 practices. And I sent the quote, and we do one agreement that can be used for every single practitioner, right? If the circumstances are the same for each practice. And he was like, why does it cost so much? And so I was like, well, because this is what we do. You said you want to manage your risk. You know the risks you're taking with your existing agreement with 5 practices. So I know I probably actually responded a little bit too strongly because I find it very frustrating that GPs refer people to specialists knowing that they have special knowledge. And someone was referred to us, that person was referred to us because they knew that we were specialists, but they don't feel the same way about other experts, which sometimes really gets my goat.
Yeah, no, it does
I
me
sound like
too.
my grandma.
I think the reality is there's an integrity piece here. You can't wish that people treated you with respect and valued your time and expertise and then not treat other people in the same way. And I think the saying that encapsulates it is if you think experts are expensive, you wait until you try amateurs. And that's the reality here, right? Is you can end up in a lot of trouble. And you can proceed for a long time without actually tripping up. And that can falsely
Yeah,
cause
get
people
you
to
in a
believe
false
they're on the
sense
right
of
path.
security. That's true.
So I think that there's sort of the things that we always battle against. So I think when we were talking, the key things here are you outlined the main agreements that people need to have in place: documentation, privacy policy, service and facility agreements, employment agreements, shareholder agreements, buy-sell agreements, reviewing lease and particularly sublease documentation where there's substantial risks with non-compliance and costs associated with that. We talked a little bit about when to start with getting legal advice. And your comment was that the earlier people are starting, that's really been a pleasing trend that people are kind of getting in early and paying for that expertise. If there's a young doctor out there listening to this, they might not actually be young, but say they're thinking, maybe I'm going to open my own practice and expand this beyond just the legal aspects of it because you're a business owner as well. So they're thinking about, and I get these messages all the time, hey, I'm thinking I'm ready to set the practice up. What do they need to be thinking about? That person that is thinking, I think I'm ready to get out of, working with or for, whatever way we want to call it, somebody else, and I want to go and run my own game. What are the sort of things that they need to be thinking about, and what should they be focused on to get the best outcome for themselves and their family?
My first hot tip would be to read my book, Growing a Medical Practice from Frustration to a High Performance Business, or listen to it. It's on Audible. You can hear me read it to you. But it does go through those things, Todd, funnily enough. It's not just a legal book. It talks about your purpose and choosing something that really you're going to be passionate about, which is the main reason people stay in business, I think, actually not just doing something as a grind that keeps you up at night worrying. So thinking about what that is going to be and then designing it so that it suits your life as well. Because a lot of business owners feel when they go into work that it's not they'd prefer to be doing something else, or they want more flexibility, but feel because they have staff they need to be there, and that's so that they're just kind of, I guess, limiting factors that business owners can have in their heads. And selling time, I do that as a lawyer. We, as business owners, sell our time or other people's time in services. And so thinking about that and whether there's other ways around it. And we do have practices that we've worked with who have created specialist intellectual property that they can then license to other practices, whether it be in the weight loss area or like that. There's been these kind of amazing things come from doctors who are thinking more innovatively and creatively. And so not feeling like you have to do what everyone else is doing. But that takes courage. It takes courage to be a business owner at all.
It takes courage, and I think the thing that it's easy, all of the thinking that's done before you enter a space, it's easy to think that that's the important thing, but the truth is what you have is inappropriate optimism. So this is the Dunning-Kruger curve.
And me thinking it's going to be less risky to start a business than get a job.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we can often romanticize the reality of things. And then once you're in a business, I think the thing that most people don't understand is that you don't have to fix everything straight away. You just have to fix the thing that is most important. So I'll give you an example on this that I ran a webinar recently, which was on GP recruitment. And I asked people to give themselves a score in the chat as to how important it was. Most people, it was a 10 out of 10 for them. It was really critical. Maybe a couple of 9s in there. And then I said, okay, now you're going to score how much time, attention, and resources you're putting towards this. Not one of them came back with a 9 or a 10. It was more somewhere between 3 and 7. So again, if we talk about integrity, there's just a lack of integrity with alignment. And I'll tell you why. It's probably not because they didn't think that's important, but they're doing other things that aren't actually that priority. And so if you've got a singular focus, that's the important thing to get to, not all of the other things that you might like doing, but they're not actually going to solve the problems.
And creating time for that. So I've got a client who on Mondays, that's when she does all her business stuff. And I know that if I'm going to have an appointment with her, it'll be on a Monday. And that's great because then the other days she can just focus on seeing patients.
I think that's a great hack, and that's a lovely way to end the podcast. Sarah Bartholomeusz, You Legal, I'm super grateful for your wisdom, your sharing, and education for the audience. We'll make sure that your contact details are in the show notes below. Those of you that are listening, thank you for your attention. If you've got anything you'd like to know from Sarah, put that in the comments below this or email us about that. Otherwise, have a fabulous day. We'll see you at the next Scale My Clinic podcast. Bye.
Bye.